If presence is real and immediate, why does it seem to dissolve the moment we try to name or define it? This question points to a quiet but persistent tension in modern thought. We tend to assume that naming clarifies reality. What can be labeled, categorized, and described is treated as real and reliable. What resists naming is often dismissed as vague, subjective, or even illusory. Yet this assumption deserves scrutiny. Consider your own experience. The most immediate moment's attention, awareness, silence, pain, or presence itself are already happening before you describe them. The description arrives later. This suggests that naming may not reveal presence, but replace it with a conceptual substitute. At the center of this lecture is a precise claim articulated by Ibn Arabi. He argues that the most fundamental presence cannot be captured by language because naming belongs to cognition, while presence precedes cognition. Presence is not something we generate by thought. It is something already given. Prior to interpretation, modern psychological life is characterized by constant mental activity. People report chronic distraction, internal noise, and a sense of disconnection, even while being continuously stimulated. Despite unprecedented access to information, many experienced reduced contact with immediate reality. From a cognitive science perspective, this condition is linked to the overactivation of conceptual processing and the default mode network. This is the brain system associated with self-referential thinking, narrative construction, and mental simulation. When this system dominates, attention shifts away from direct perception toward interpretation and commentary. Behaviorally, this appears as compulsive labeling, over-analysis, and constant evaluation of experience. Moments are not simply lived, they are interpreted, categorized, and judged in real time. Neuroscientifically, language and symbolic processing recruit cortical systems that abstract experience. While these systems are essential for planning and communication, they also distance awareness from raw sensory presence. The core problem is not emotional weakness or spiritual failure, it is structural, modern. Individuals encounter reality primarily through representation rather than direct contact. Ibn Arabi addresses this problem not emotionally, but analytically, by separating presence itself from its mental descriptions. Ibn Arabi is frequently portrayed as a mystical poet, but this characterization obscures his primary role as a metaphysician of perception and being. His central concern was not emotional spirituality, but how reality becomes intelligible to awareness. A key distinction in his work is between presence and conceptual naming. Presence refers to what is immediately given to awareness. Before interpretation, naming refers to the cognitive act of organizing, labeling, and describing that experience. The critical premise is simple but far-reaching. Naming occurs after presence is already there. Language does not generate presence, it responds to it. Language organizes experience, but it cannot contain what precedes organization. This position stands in contrast to modern epistemology, which often equates knowledge with naming. In many contemporary frameworks, what cannot be named is treated as unknown. Ibn Arabi separates knowing from labeling. Presence can be known without being conceptually captured. The first core teaching is that presence is ontologically prior to thought and language. You are present before you describe being present. This is not a mystical claim, but a phenomenological one. Consider basic sensory. Awareness.pain is felt before it is named. Silence is experienced before it is identified as silence. Attention is already functioning before it becomes an object of thought. In each case, awareness precedes verbalization. Cognitive science supports this distinction. Research on prelinguistic processing and phenomenal consciousness shows that conscious experience arises before symbolic encoding. A common misconception follows from reversing this order. People assume that naming generates awareness. In reality, naming reports on awareness after the fact. When language is mistaken for presence itself, experience becomes abstracted and indirect. The result is contact without immediacy, knowledge without presence. Ibn Arabi's point is not anti-language. It is about proper sequencing. Language follows presence. It does not replace it. The second teaching clarifies why naming, while useful, creates distance from immediacy. The key distinction here is between representation and direct contact. Psychologically, modern attention is biased toward interpretation rather than perception. The mind prioritizes meaning-making over experiencing. Ibn Arabi observes that the act of naming inserts the self as an observer, creating a subtle separation between awareness and what is known. This can be seen clearly in emotional regulation. Overthinking emotions, constantly labeling and analyzing them, often intensifies distress rather than reducing it. Clinical psychology shows that excessive verbal processing can interfere with emotional regulation by pulling attention away from embodied experience. Neuroscientifically, verbal labeling increases cortical activity associated with analysis, while reducing limbic engagement associated with felt presence. This shift stabilizes meaning, but weakens immediacy. The insight here is precise. Naming helps organize experience, but it does so by creating distance. Presence becomes something observed rather than inhabited. Ibn Arabi does not argue against naming. He argues against confusing it with presence itself. A widespread modern assumption is that what cannot be named is unknowable or mystical in a vague sense. Ibn Arabi directly challenges this view. For him, the unnameable is not unknown. It is overly present. Some realities are too immediate to be objectified. A rational analogy clarifies this point. You cannot see your own eyes directly, yet they are not absent. Their very proximity makes them unavailable as objects. Cognitive science refers to this as non-representational awareness, forms of knowing that do not rely on symbolic encoding. Studies in contemplative neuroscience confirm that awareness can be stable without narrative description. The implication is important. Presence cannot be turned into an object without ceasing to be presence. This is not anti-intellectualism. It is a recognition of the boundary between cognition and awareness. Certain forms of knowing operate through alignment rather than representation. Ibn Arabi extends this logic to theology with philosophical consistency. God, in his framework, is not an object within presence. God is presence itself. Names describe attributes, functions, or relations. They do not capture essence. When God is treated as an object of thought, distance is introduced. Psychologically, this reinforces projection, human concepts imposed onto reality. A modern parallel can be found in systems theory. An observer cannot fully step outside the system they are observing. Similarly, presence cannot be fully objectified from within presence. The insight is not theological mysticism. It is structural logic. Divine presence is immediately given, yet conceptually unreachable. This explains why naming God never exhausts meaning, and why certainty does not increase with explanation. This leads to a paradox. The most certain realities are often the least describable. Cognitive science supports this through known limits of semantic encoding and working memory. Language compresses experience. Compression always involves loss. Ibn Arabi's subtle claim is that true certainty increases silence, not explanation. Silence here is epistemic, not devotional. It reflects alignment rather than ignorance. A misconception must be clarified. This silence is not emotional withdrawal or anti-rationalism. It is recognition of cognitive limits. Presence is known not by accumulating definitions, but by reducing interference. Knowledge reaches its boundary where awareness begins. Practically, this teaching invites a cognitive shift. Notice moments when naming replaces awareness, when interpretation overtakes perception. This awareness alone reduces representational distance. In emotional regulation, allowing sensations and emotions to be present without immediate labeling improves stability. Research shows that reducing narrative elaboration lowers stress responses. Attention training follows the same principle, strengthening. Present moment awareness does not require suppressing cognition. It requires placing it in proper sequence. Neuroscientifically, this reduces default mode activity and improves attentional stability. Ibn Arabi's practical outcome is not withdrawal from reason. It is proximity to reality. Presence becomes something lived rather than explained. The central conclusion is clear. Presence cannot be named because naming belongs to thought, not being. What is most real is least. Arabi's lasting contribution is a precise map of where knowledge ends and awareness begins. This is not a rejection of language. It is a clarification of its limits. Presence does not need explanation. It needs recognition.